You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium, available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about the dark truth behind the story of Hansel and Gretel. So it's over to you now, Mark, to share this dark truth behind a child's fairy tale.
Hansel and Gretel is a German fairy tale collected by the Brothers Grimm, which was first published in 1812 as part of the Grimm's Fairy Tales collection. In the collection, Hansel and Gretel are written as a brother and sister who are abandoned in the forest and consequently fall into the hands of an evil witch who lives in a house made of bread, cake, sugar and various other sweet confectionaries. The witch, who sees Hansel and Gretel as an answer to the question as to what will go with her roast potatoes this weekend, then decides to try to fatten Hansel up before she can eventually eat him. And, to cut a long story short, his sister, Gretel, manages to save her brother by pushing the evil witch into her own oven, killing her, and then escaping with a candy-infested home. The true story behind Hansel and Gretel does have a slightly darker tone to it than the Grimm's fairy tale, and goes back to a variety of stories that originated in the Baltic regions during the Great Famine of 1314 to 1322, which caused devastating results across the globe, with one scholar estimating that this starvation catastrophe affected nearly 400,000 square miles of Europe and 30 million people, killing off, in certain areas, up to 25% of the population. Some reports claim that the famine was so bad and that the people were so hungry that in order to survive they would extract bodies of the dead from cemeteries and dig out the flesh from their skulls in order to eat its contents. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this House of Confectionery episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a medium, a ufologist, a true crime buff, a man with a very dark and disturbing sense of humour who gets strangeness dominating his life because being ordinary can be quite dull at times. But just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every week, usually on a Monday night, though occasionally on a Tuesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of other paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, serial killers, and the occasional missing person that often goes unnoticed. So, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review or an opinion of the episode subject that I can reply to, a thumbs up, and subscribe to my channel. Or if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the rather bleak story surrounding the dark truth behind the story of Hansel and Gretel. And this week's necessary disclaimer: this episode is a tale that sadly involves people dying through natural disasters and child abandonment, so may prove upsetting to some. You listen at your own discretion. Also, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case remain. I also apologise, again, if I pronounce anything incorrectly. In fact, just to go slightly off subject, someone asked me the other day if I had ringing in my ears, so I replied by telling them that doesn't work for me, but how about tomorrow nightus? No? OK, let's get back to the story. The first thing to ask ourselves is, who were the Brothers Grimm? Well, I won't go into the full story of them on here because, interesting that they are, I don't like making my shows too long, so here's a potted history. The Brothers Grimm were Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, who were German academics who, together in the 1800s, collected and published tales of folklore. Some of the brothers' best-known works of folk tales were popularised in stories such as Cinderella, The Frog Prince, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, and of course Hansel and Gretel, with their first collection of stories called Children's and Household Tales, being first published back in 1812. Both of the Grimm brothers spent most of their formative years living in the town of Hanau. Is it Hanau? Hanau? Hanau, that'll do. Which was located in the Landgraviate of Hesse-Kassel, also known as the Hessian Palatinate. Their father, Philip Grimm, died in 1796 when Jacob was 11 and Wilhelm was 10 years old. And this event consequently caused great poverty for the rest of the family, which affected both the Grimm brothers for many years after. Come forward a few years, and both of the Grimm brothers were by now attending the University of Marburg, which was located in Germany. And whilst they were there, they developed a strong curiosity about German folklore, which for them grew into a lifelong dedication to collecting German folk tales. In 19th century Europe, a revived interest in traditional folk stories, which to the Grimm brothers represented a pure form of national literature and culture, they established a methodology for collecting and recording old legends and oral myths that became the basis for folklore tales or folklore studies, and between 1812 and 1857 their first collection of folk tales was both revised and republished many times, growing from 86 to more than 200 stories. The popularity of the Grimm's collected folk tales has endured, with them not only being available in more than 100 translations across the globe, but with some of them having been adapted by renowned filmmakers, for example Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In the mid-20th century, Nazi Germany, as part of their propaganda programme, decided to weaponise the Brothers Grimm's work, and later in the 20th century, despite the sexuality, cruelty and violence in some of the tales' original versions, the psychologist Bruno Bettelheim reaffirmed the work's true value. In addition to writing and modifying old legends and folk tales, the Brothers Grimm also wrote a collection of well-respected Germanic and Scandinavian mythologies, and in 1838 they began writing a definitive German dictionary on the very same subject. However, unfortunately, they were unable to complete it. So, what of the story of Hansel and Gretel? Well, I know most of you probably already know the tale, but just to give you some kind of context, I'll give you a potted version. It all starts with a pair of children, a brother and sister going by the names of Hansel and Gretel, who were to be abandoned by their starving parents in the forest. The children, on overhearing their parents' plans, once abandoned in the aforementioned forest, managed to find their way home by following a trail of stones Hansel had dropped earlier on. The mother, or stepmother, depending on which book you read of course, then convinces the father to abandon the children a second time. Only this time Hansel, instead of dropping stones, which was probably due to them being a little heavy on his pockets, decided to drop breadcrumbs instead to help guide them both home. However, this was a fatal and flawed idea, mainly because the birds, who were also feeling a little peckish, excuse the pun, decided to eat the breadcrumbs, so consequently when the children were left in the forest, this time they were completely lost. Then both Hansel and Gretel, whilst wandering around the forest trying to find their way back home, suddenly came across a house that was made from gingerbread, and as the brother and sister were feeling a little ravenous, they decided to consume the house that was made from the delicious cookie dough. However, unbeknown to both Hansel and Gretel, the home was a trap set by an old witch, who then enslaves Gretel and forces her to overfeed Hansel so that he can be consumed by the witch herself. After a few days of Gretel convincing the old witch that Hansel has yet to put on enough weight to be eaten, the pair managed to escape when Gretel shoves the witch into her own oven. The children then managed to return to their home again with not only -1 witch, but also with the old crone's treasure, only to find out that their evil matriarch, meaning their stepmother of course, is no longer living with their father, so therefore they presume she must be dead, and everyone lives happily ever after, blah blah blah. There, I think that was pretty straightforward, wasn't it? After this first short break, in part 2, we will look at the origin of the Hansel and Gretel story and how it is related to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317.
This show is brought to you courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11 Regent Street, Hinckley, LE10 1AW. Open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for guided tours of the haunted rooms at just £3 per person. Booking is essential at all times, and over 16s only please, unless accompanied by an adult. The haunted rooms are extremely haunted, and paranormal activity could and has taken place at any time. Some areas and particular objects or items can be quite scary and unnerving. Membership is available for £25 to qualify for selective offers. And why not download the app, available on both iOS and Android for only $3.99, to keep up to date with what is coming up at the centre.
Although Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm credited a variety of tales from Hesse, the region where they both lived, as their source, many scholars have argued that the Brothers Grimm first heard the story of Hansel and Gretel in 1809 from various other sources, with their main source being from Wilhelm Grimm's future wife, Dotchen Wild. But no matter where the story of Hansel and Gretel originates, there is no denying that it is a pretty dark tale, including things like child abandonment, attempted cannibalism, enslavement, and even murder. However, the origins of the story are just as shadowy, dismal and, dare I use the pun, grim. And as I mentioned in my intro to this episode, the story behind the Hansel and Gretel account does have a slightly darker tone to it than the Grimm's fairy tale, with it going back to a variety of stories that originated in the Baltic regions during the Great Famine of 1314 to 1322, which caused devastating results across the globe. The Great Famine of 1314 to 1322, although it is occasionally dated as 1314 to 1317, was the first of a series of large-scale crises that struck parts of Europe early in the 14th century, with most of Europe extending east to Poland and south of the Alps being affected, causing many deaths over an extended number of years, and marked a clear end to the period of growth and prosperity from the 11th to the 13th centuries. It all started with the bad weather in the spring of 1315, which led to crop failures that lasted right up until the summer harvest in 1317, with most of Europe not fully recovering until 1322. It was reported that this famine was caused by what was later called the Little Ice Age, which was a period of widespread cooling and a drop in the average global temperature that brought the cold weather and torrential rains into Europe. These torrential rains were particularly harmful to the food supply, as they rotted many crops and promoted disease that infected livestock, with cattle disease causing sheep and cattle numbers to fall as much as 80% in parts. The period was also marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, along with cannibalism and infanticide. On a short but interesting side note here, infanticide, or otherwise known as infant homicide, is the intentional killing of an infant or offspring. Infanticide was a widespread practice throughout human history that was mainly used to dispose of unwanted children, with its main purpose being the prevention of resources being spent on weak or disabled offspring. Unwanted infants were usually abandoned to die of exposure, as in the case of Hansel and Gretel, but in some societies they were deliberately killed. Infanticide is generally illegal.
Generally? Really? Okay.
Generally illegal, but in some places the practice is tolerated, or the prohibition is not strictly enforced. Researchers have found that mothers are more likely to commit infanticide, but in cases of neonaticide, or murder within the first 24 hours of life, mothers account for almost all the perpetrators. However, fatherly cases of neonaticide are very rare. Throughout the spring and summer of 1315, it continued to rain, with the temperatures remaining cool. As a result, under these conditions, the grain could not ripen, which led to widespread crop failures and a lack of straw and hay for the livestock. This continuous rainfall also meant that the soil was becoming extremely moist, making it impossible to plough the fields ready for planting the next crops. So, due to this lack of planting and harvesting, the actual prices of food began to rise, with prices in England doubling between the spring and midsummer of that year. Meat increased from 30 to 40 shillings, and in some places wheat prices rose by 320%, making bread unaffordable for peasants, which meant that, because of the general increased population pressures and even lower than average harvests, some of the people would go hungry, with a few, in order to avoid starvation, even beginning to harvest their own food stocks, which included things like wild edible roots, grasses, nuts, and even the bark from trees. There are several documented incidents that show the extent of how bad the famine was. For example, on the 10th of August 1315, when Edward II of England stopped at St Albans in Herefordshire, even he had difficulty finding bread for himself and his entourage. I think I should point out here, and to give that paragraph some sort of context, the idea that the King of England himself was unable to eat was an extremely rare occasion. And in Bristol, again in the UK, in the city's chronicles, it was reported that in 1315 there was, and I quote,
"a great famine of death, with such mortality that the living could scarcely survive to bury the dead, with horseflesh and dog's flesh being accounted for as good meat, and some people even eating their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear into pieces those such as were newly put into prison, and devoured them half alive."
Meanwhile, in that same year of 1315, the French, under King Louis X, tried to invade Flanders in northern Belgium, but due to the low-lying areas of the Netherlands, the fields were soaked and the army became bogged down, and so consequently they were forced to retreat, burning all their abandoned provisions due to the fact that the soldiers were unable to carry them back. In the spring of 1316, it continued to weigh on the European population that was already deprived of any energy and of any reserves to sustain itself, with all segments of society from nobles to peasants being affected, especially the peasants, who represented 95% of the population and had no food supplies in reserve. In order to provide some measure of relief for the starving population, the future was mortgaged in a variety of ways. These included slaughtering the draft animals, eating the seed grain, voluntary starvation so that the younger generation could continue to work the fields, and the abandonment of children and old people to fend for themselves, again as mentioned in the Hansel and Gretel story. It was also noted in the chronicles of the time that there were many incidents of cannibalism, with it being reported that during the famine people would open the graves of the newly dead and buried and claim them as food, although according to a Lynn H. Nelson, who was a lecturer in medieval history, she said, and I quote,
"One can never tell if such talk was not simply a matter of rumour mongering."
The height of the famine was in 1317 as the wet weather continued. However, in the summer of that same year, the weather started to return to some sort of normality. The problem was that by then humanity was so weakened by both the famine-related diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis and tuberculosis, and the fact that so much of the seed stock had been eaten, that it was not until 1325, nearly 8 years later, that the food supply started to return to some sort of relative normality, and that the levels of the world population could start to increase. Many historians debate the toll, but it is estimated that between 10 and 25% of the European population in many towns and cities died as a result of the Great Famine. And although the Black Death, which occurred between 1347 and 1351, would kill more people, it happened by sweeping through an area in a matter of months, whereas the Great Famine lingered for years, prolonging the suffering of the European population. Just a quick side note regarding the Black Death before we go into part 3 of the show. The Black Death was a bubonic plague pandemic that occurred in Europe from 1346 to 1353 and was one of the most fatal pandemics in human history, with as many as 50 million people perishing, which at the time was perhaps 50% of Europe's 14th century population. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was spread by fleas and through the air, making it one of the most significant events in European history, with far-reaching population, economic and cultural impacts. After the Black Plague had spread throughout the populace, the European population did not regain its 14th century level again until the 16th century, with the last outbreak recorded to have occurred in the early 19th century. The Great Famine's impact also affected the speed in which the Black Death spread, due to an already weakened population suffering an additional calamity. After this second short break, in part 3 we will look at the consequences and the aftermath of the Great Famine, and a final look at the Brothers Grimm book of Hansel and Gretel.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07 852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk. Or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 led to a stark increase in crime, even amongst those who were not normally inclined to get involved in any criminal activity. This was because people would resort to any means possible in order to feed themselves and their families. And according to reports, for the next several decades after the Great Famine, Europe took on a much tougher and violent edge, with it becoming an even less amicable place than during the 12th and 13th centuries, with this much tougher and violent edge being noticed across all segments of society. The most notable was perhaps in the way that warfare was conducted back in the 14th century during the 100 Years' War, at a time when chivalry ended, as opposed to the 12th and 13th centuries when nobles were more than likely to die by accident during a tournament game rather than on the battlefield. The Great Famine also underlined the confidence in medieval governments of the time, mainly due to their failures in trying to deal with the resulting crisis, with this having particularly dire consequences for King Edward II, who was already an unpopular monarch anyway. And while the Great Famine was seen as a divine retribution in both England and on the continent, the English were more inclined to blame their misfortunes on the perceived misrule and immorality of the king, as opposed to the alleged misconduct within the church, with this perceived misrule and immorality eventually in 1327 contributing to King Edward II's downfall. The Great Famine also ended an era of unprecedented population growth that originally started circa 1050, although some experts believe that growth had already been slowing down for several decades, and that it was the Great Famine itself that brought this population growth period to an undisputed conclusion. According to the folklorist Jack Zipes, the Brothers Grimm tale of Hansel and Gretel celebrates the symbolic order of the patriarchal home as a haven protected from the dangerous characters outside that threaten the lives of the children, and at the same time it systematically denigrates the adult female characters which are seemingly intertwined between each other. Jack Zipes also says that the death of the mother, or stepmother, so soon after the children killed the witch suggests that they may be metaphorically the same woman. Which, to be perfectly honest with you, until I started to research the story properly for this podcast, is something that I never really thought about before. How slow am I? Anyway, I continue. Jack Zipes also argues that the importance of the tale in the European oral and literary tradition may be explained by the theme of child abandonment and abuse, and that due to families and the lack of birth control for that time, it was common in medieval Europe to abandon unwanted children by leaving them in front of churches and or in woods and forests. He also points out that the death of the mother during childbirth sometimes led to tensions after marriage, so Jack Snipes proposes that this scenario may have played a role in the emergence of the motif of the wicked stepmother. Just a short but interesting side note here. Jack David Zipes is a literary scholar, author and Professor Emeritus, or retired full professor, in the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic and Dutch at the University of Minnesota. However, the linguist and folklorist Edward Vajda, who has proposed that these stories represent the remnant of a coming-of-age and rite-of-passage tale that existed in the Proto-Indo-European society, meaning that it is the reconstructed common ancestor of the Indo-European language, and the psychologist Bruno Bettelheim argues that the main motive around these type of stories revolves around dependence, oral greed and destructive desires that children must learn to overcome after they arrive home purged of their oral fixations. But others have simply stressed that it's all about the satisfying psychological effects of the children vanquishing the witch and or realising the death of their wicked stepmother. From what I can tell, the Brothers Grimm tale of Hansel and Gretel has continued to evolve over the years, with versions today that are meant for preschoolers, not even touching on any of the children abandonment themes. But whatever you think regarding the tale of the brother and sister eating an old lady's home, there is no denying that it is still a top-selling children's book that has been translated into over 160 languages since the Brothers Grimm first published it in 1812.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 135, we are going to be looking at the tragic story of Amanda Todd. Amanda Todd was a 15-year-old Canadian student and victim of cyberbullying who hanged herself at her home in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. A Dutch-Turkish man named Aidan Coban, who was already imprisoned for sexual blackmail in the Netherlands, was extradited to Canada to face trial on charges of harassing and sexually extorting Amanda Todd before her suicide. In response to her death, the then Premier of British Columbia, Christy Clark, made an online statement of condolence and suggested a national discussion on criminalising cyberbullying.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations of all the names and places. Now, I'm going to stop there because there was one time I said it was 1314 to 1322. It was actually 1315 for 1322. I do apologise in case everybody spotted that error that I did on purpose. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I'll see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast as a thank you. If you wish, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you're listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember, guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.